There are moments inside royal palaces that never make it into press releases. Moments that happen behind closed doors, in the spaces between formal dinners and carefully choreographed public appearances. Moments that leave marks, not on skin, but on something softer, something that takes years to understand. This is one of those moments, and it begins, as many of the most painful things do, with a family that was never quite a family in the way anyone had planned. When King Charles married Camilla Parker Bowles in April 2005, the world watched with a complicated mix of emotions. There were those who celebrated, those who grieved for Diana all over again, and those who simply waited to see what would happen next. What the cameras couldn't capture was the invisible architecture being assembled inside the royal household, the careful, cautious way children were introduced to step-parents, the way half-siblings learned to share space, or the way old wounds were expected to close simply because a ceremony had taken place and champagne had been poured. Camilla came with 2 children of her own, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, both adults by the time their mother married into the most scrutinized family in the world. They weren't strangers to privilege. They had grown up in the orbit of wealth, country houses, and the particular ease that comes with knowing the right people. But they were strangers to this specific kind of exposure. The royal family doesn't simply absorb you. Plus, it requires a kind of surrender that most people, raised outside its walls, aren't prepared to give. Tom Parker Bowles, in particular, occupied a peculiar position. He was charming in the way that men raised in soft circumstances often are. Easy with words, comfortable in rooms, practiced at the kind of wit that makes dinner tables feel lighter. So he had built a career as a food writer and television personality, and he wore his mother's new status with the relaxed confidence of someone who understood that the best way to survive scrutiny was to smile into it. He was photographed at events. He was quoted in columns. He gave the impression of a man entirely unbothered by the gravity of his family's new position. But charm is not the same as character, and ease in public is not the same as grace in private. Princess Charlotte was born in May 2015, the second child of Prince William, and Catherine, now Princess of Wales. From her very first public appearance, that small pink bundle carried down the steps of the Lindo wing. She carried something about her that was difficult to name. A watchfulness, honestly, an awareness. Even as an infant, she seemed to be observing the world with eyes that were doing more than simply seeing. She grew into a child who was described by those who knew her as sharp, sensitive, deeply attuned to the emotional temperature of any room she entered. She had her great-grandmother's composure and her father's intensity, and something else entirely that was purely her own. The Wales children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, grew up understanding from a very young age that their lives existed on 2 tracks simultaneously. There was the private track, on the one with school runs and kitchen suppers and arguments over television. And then there was the public track, the one with waving from balconies and sitting through ceremonies and learning how to hold a face still when the cameras were pointed at you. Most children have only one track. The burden of running 2 at once and keeping them from colliding is something no preparation can fully address. William, I think, was vigilant about their private track. He had grown up watching his own private life become public property in ways that caused damage he was still, decades later, working through. He wasn't going to allow that for his children. The boundaries he drew were firm and, in the estimation of many people around him, entirely reasonable. His children's emotional lives weren't available for consumption. Their relationships weren't press release material, which their vulnerabilities were theirs alone. What this meant, in practice, was that certain things were never supposed to leave the family. Certain episodes were filed away into the category of things that simply did not happen, at least not in any version of the story that would ever be told outside the relevant rooms. William wasn't naive enough to believe that secrets could be kept forever inside an institution as porous as the modern monarchy. But he believed, with the particular stubbornness of a man who had learned his lessons in the worst possible way, that some things deserved protection. The relationship between the Wales children and Camilla's family had always been managed with the kind of careful attention that suggests underlying fragility. Charles was their grandfather, and they loved him in the way children love a grandfather, who arrives with warmth and leaves before the difficult parts begin. Camilla was their step-grandmother, and the children were polite in the way they had been raised to be polite. Genuinely, not performatively, but with a kind of reserve that preserved a comfortable distance. Tom and Laura, as the adult children of this step-grandmother, occupied an even more peripheral position. They weren't quite family. They weren't quite strangers. They existed in the particular social category of people you see at Christmas and are perfectly pleasant to, and then don't think about for 11 months. Charlotte was aware of this architecture. Plus, and she was aware of it the way perceptive children are always aware of the invisible agreements that organize adult social life. Not because anyone explained it to her, but because she had learned to read rooms, and rooms carry information that words often conceal. The incident that would eventually bring all of this structure into question did not begin dramatically. The worst things rarely do, which they begin in ordinary settings, with ordinary-sounding words, and in moments that seem unremarkable until they suddenly, irreversibly, aren't. It began at a family gathering, one of those occasions that exist in the royal calendar as mandatory exercises in the performance of unity. Everyone present understood what the gathering was for, which was to prove, to each other and to history, that the combined family was functional and affectionate, and free of the tensions that everyone in the room privately acknowledged. Charlotte was present. She was old enough, by this point, to participate rather than simply be arranged decoratively in the scene. She was observing everything, as she always did, filing away the small data points that told her something true about the people around her. Tom was present too, and he was in the particular kind of mood that charming men sometimes arrive in, the mood that has had one drink too many of its own confidence, that finds its own wit a little more amusing than the occasion warrants, that forgets, or perhaps simply doesn't care, that not everyone in the room is an adult who can absorb a casual cruelty and metabolize it into dinner-party anecdote. What he said, for what it's worth, and the specific words are less important than their effect, was directed at Charlotte in a way that seemed, on its surface, like the kind of teasing that adults sometimes use with children under the mistaken impression that it constitutes affection. But it wasn't affectionate. It was the kind of comment that lands like a hand pressed flat against an open window. The pressure is casual, but the fall is serious. Charlotte went still. She did not cry immediately, because Charlotte wasn't a child who cried easily in front of people she did not fully trust. She had inherited her father's discipline in that regard, the capacity to absorb something. That wants to come out and hold it compressed inside your chest until you can release it somewhere safer. She held it. She held it through the rest of whatever social ritual was required of her. She held it with the same watchful composure that had been present on her face since she was an infant being carried down the steps of the Lindo wing. But she was a child, and the thing about children is that they can't hold forever what adults have trained themselves to hold for years. Later, in a moment when the geography of the gathering had shifted and the adults were redistributed into different conversations, and she did not hold it anymore. William did not witness the original comment. He was in another part of the room, doing the work that royal gatherings require, moving between people, saying the right things, keeping the performance aloft. He wasn't there, to be honest, for the moment itself. He found out about it afterward. So when the way he found out was the way fathers find out about things that have been done to their children, through the particular quality of tears that aren't about a scraped knee or a lost toy or a fight with a sibling, but about something a person outside the family has pressed against the child and left a mark. He understood immediately that this wasn't something small. Charlotte wasn't a TBH dramatic child. Plus, she did actually not perform distress. When she cried, and it meant something had genuinely reached her, had gotten through the composure and the training and the watchfulness, and landed in the soft place underneath. William knew this, and knowing this, he understood that whatever had happened wasn't minor, not a misunderstanding, not something that could be waved away with the explanation that adults don't always realize how their words land with children. He did not react immediately. This was something he had learned, that the first reaction, when in situations involving the institution, the complicated webs of family obligation that the institution generated, was rarely the right reaction. The first reaction was emotional. It was protective in the way that a father's protection is always slightly terrifying in its completeness. He set it aside. He gathered information. Plus, he TBH, asked questions in the measured way that people who have grown up inside formal structures learn to gather information. Not as interrogation, but as archaeology, carefully brushing away layers to find the shape of what actually happened. What, to be fair, he found, did not make him less angry. It confirmed the anger and gave it a specific address. The question now was what to do with it. There were several, to be fair, forces working against a direct confrontation. The first was institutional. Tom Parker Bowles was Camilla's son, and Camilla was now queen consort. Any friction between William and Tom had the potential to ripple outward in ways that would require management at levels above the immediate family. The kind of management that involves private secretaries and careful language and the exhausting translation of genuine human emotion into diplomatic statement. William had no, in my opinion, interest in creating that kind of incident. He had spent his adult life watching genuine emotion get translated into diplomatic statement, and he knew what was lost in the process. The second force was Charlotte herself. She hadn't asked her father to intervene. She hadn't presented the situation as something requiring official response. She had simply finally let herself cry in a moment she believed was private, and the privacy had turned out to be less complete than she thought. William was aware that intervening on her behalf without her explicit request was a complicated thing, that children, even children who are, and also princesses, deserve the dignity of having their pain treated, as belonging to them, not as a problem to be solved by a parent. He held to be fair, these competing forces inside himself for some time. Days, possibly. Plus, the kind of time in which you turn a problem over in your hands repeatedly, examining its edges, trying to identify which side of it faces the least amount of damage. What he couldn't do was let it go entirely. That option had closed the moment he understood what had made his daughter cry. The decision he eventually reached wasn't the dramatic confrontation that the protective fury inside him had initially demanded. It was quieter than that, more precise. Plus, it was the kind of response that operates not through volume, but through clarity, the kind that leaves the recipient in no doubt about what has been communicated, while leaving no evidence that anything was communicated at all. And William was very good at this. It was one of the skills that people who underestimated him consistently failed to account for. But even before that response could take shape, something else happened. Something that would complicate the entire situation in a way that William hadn't anticipated. Because the thing about information inside the royal family is that it doesn't travel in straight lines. It moves through corridors and kitchens and private conversations between people who trust each other. And by the time it arrives at its destination, it's sometimes picked up additional weight, additional context, additional implications that the original event did not contain. Someone had talked, and not about Charlotte's tears. Those had been witnessed by almost no one. But about what Tom had said. And about what William knew. And the confluence of those two pieces of information in the wrong set of ears produced something that William had in particular, deliberately, carefully, tried to prevent. It became a thing that was known beyond the room. And that meant it was now a different kind of problem entirely. Because secrets that leave a room become stories. And stories in the orbit of the royal family have a particular gravity. They pull everything toward them, compress nuance into headline, replace the complicated truth with the version that's easiest to carry. William had been trying to protect Charlotte. He had been trying to handle the situation with the kind of quiet precision that resolved it without amplifying it. He had been operating inside the careful logic of a father who also understood the machinery of the institution he served. The machinery had other ideas. And Charlotte, who, to be fair, had gone still in that room, who had held herself composed through the remainder of a gathering she had every right to leave, who had only finally, privately, let herself cry, was now at the center of something she had never asked to be part of. The tears had been real. They had been hers. And now, they were something else too. Now they were a secret William was never supposed to know. And that meant, in the particular mathematics of the royal family, that knowing them had consequences. Not just for him, but for everyone the knowledge had touched on its way to him. The gathering had ended. The photographs, I think, had been taken. The official record showed nothing but the careful warmth of a family functioning as families are supposed to function. Underneath that record, something had shifted. Kind of, Charlotte knew it. I think William knew it. And like somewhere in the complicated geography of this family, that was never quite a family in the way anyone had planned, Tom Parker Bowles knew it too. What none of them knew yet was how far the consequences would travel, or who else would be standing in the room when they finally arrived. That part was still coming. The royal household operates on a principle that outsiders rarely understand until they have spent enough time in its orbit to feel the mechanism at work. The principle is this: nothing is ever simply personal. Every private emotion has a public dimension, and every family argument has an institutional implication. Every tear cried behind a closed door is, in some structural sense, a political event, because the people crying are not private citizens, and the doors they cry behind open onto corridors that connect to rooms where decisions are made about nations and legacies and the management of history. William understood this principle with the bone-deep comprehension of someone who had been educated in it, not by tutors, but by experience. And he had watched it operate on his mother. He had watched Diana's private anguish become public spectacle, had watched the institution respond to her pain, not with compassion, with the cold efficiency of a machine that processes inconvenience into narrative. He had been a child the first time he understood that the family he belonged to was also an apparatus, and that the apparatus had priorities that did not always align with the welfare of the people inside it. This understanding had made him many things. It had made him guarded. Plus, it had made him strategic in ways that people sometimes mistook for coldness. It had made him a father who drew boundaries around his children's emotional lives with the intensity of someone who had learned what happens when those boundaries are absent. It had also made him, in the weeks following the incident at the gathering, someone who was operating on two levels simultaneously, the visible level, where he continued to perform all the functions his position required, and the invisible level, where he was doing the kind of quiet, methodical assessment that his years inside the institution had trained him to do. He wasn't the only one doing this assessment. Camilla was aware that something had happened. She wasn't well, a woman who missed things. Plus, to be honest, she had handled the royal family's internal world for longer than anyone gave her credit for. She had been part of it informally, in the most complicated way possible, for years before she became part of it officially. She knew its pressure points and its fault lines, and the particular way that silence inside this family wasn't the absence of communication, but its most precise form. She had felt the shift in the room after the gathering. She had felt it in the way William held himself in subsequent encounters, not hostile, not cold, but with the specific quality of a man who has added something to an internal ledger and hasn't yet decided what the total means. She was also Camilla, which meant she understood loyalty to her children the way she understood most things, completely, and with a practicality that did not permit sentimentality. Tom was her son. He was difficult in the way charming people are often difficult. He did not always read the temperature of a room accurately. He did not always apply the same intelligence to his social behavior that he applied to his professional work. He occasionally confused his ease with permission. She knew this. She had known it for the entirety of his life, and she loved him with the particular, clear-eyed love of a mother who sees her child accurately and loves him anyway, rather than the distorted love that requires not seeing. But she also knew when her child had made a mistake that carried consequences beyond his immediate circle. The specific geometry of this mistake was what made it complicated. It, for what it's worth, wasn't simply that Tom had been careless with a child's feelings. That would have basically been resolvable. An apology, a private acknowledgement, the careful work of repair that families do when someone has caused unintended harm. The complication was that the child in question was Charlotte, and Charlotte's father was William. And William, for what it's worth, wasn't a man who filed things in the category of resolved until they were actually resolved, not just. Declared resolved in the way that institutions prefer things to be, quickly, quietly, with minimum disruption to the surface. He was going to want something. Camilla could feel the shape of it without yet being able to see it clearly. Meanwhile, the information that had escaped the room was doing what escaped information does. It was moving. The specific trajectory of royal gossip is not like civilian gossip. It doesn't travel through text messages and casual conversation. It travels through the infrastructure of proximity, household staff, personal assistants, the people who are present at private moments and who carry what they witness the way stones carry heat, slowly releasing it into the surrounding air. By the time information has traveled this route, it's been handled by enough pairs of hands that its original shape is somewhat altered. Details have been compressed. I guess context has been lost. The emotional texture of the original event has been flattened into something more portable, more transferable. What had reached the wrong ears, in its traveled form, was approximately this. Something had happened at a family gathering. A child had been upset. William was aware of it, and William wasn't happy. This was accurate as far as it went. What it did not carry was the specific weight of Charlotte's composure, holding and then releasing, the way she had absorbed the comment and processed it privately before the holding became impossible. That, in my opinion, the part that made William's anger not a reaction to an event, but a response to understanding something true about his daughter's experience, did not survive the translation. What also did not survive the translation was William's deliberateness. The people who received the traveled version of events assumed that his response would be proportional to the simplified version of the story. A father's irritation, quickly expressed and quickly resolved. The kind of minor friction that large, blended families regularly generate and regularly absorb. They did, I guess, not account for the version of William that had been assembled by specific experience. They didn't understand that what he was holding wasn't irritation, but something older and more structural. The accumulated knowledge of a man who understood exactly what it meant when someone treated his child as though the child's feelings were available for casual use. The thing that made the situation genuinely complex, the thing that elevated it from family friction to something with institutional weight, was what happened next. Not sort of what William did. Not yet. What happened next was the appearance of external interest. A story was being assembled, not by the family, not by the palace, not through any official channel, by the particular ecosystem of royal reporting that had been orbiting the family for generations, the commentators and correspondents and well-placed sources who treated the emotional lives of the Windsors as raw material, and who had developed over decades the ability to take fragments of genuine experience and build from them narratives that served specific purposes in the management of the public's perception of the monarchy. The like narrative being assembled wasn't sympathetic to William. This wasn't an accident, which there are people who benefit from the public seeing William as difficult, as controlling, as the architect of ruptures rather than their target. The story of a father angry on his daughter's behalf, handled with precision, becomes in the wrong, telling the story of a prince who can't tolerate his family's connections, who is isolating himself and his children from the broader royal network, who is the subtext that always travels beneath the surface of these stories, continuing to be the problem. William was aware this was happening. He had been aware of it in various forms for years. He understood that the narrative about him was being written by people with interests that had nothing to do with the truth of his experience. He had made, at various points in his life, the mistake of engaging with this narrative directly, of attempting to correct it through counterstatement, of believing that the truth, clearly stated, had competitive power against a well-constructed story told with the authority of institutional adjacency. He no longer made that mistake. What he did instead, and in response to the emerging narrative, was something much harder. He did nothing visible. Plus, he continued to appear where he was required to appear. He continued, I guess, to perform the functions of his position with the consistency and competence that had become, over years, his most effective armor. He allowed the narrative to run, knowing that narratives sustained by distortion have a structural weakness. They require constant maintenance, constant feeding of new distortions, because the real events refuse to conform to the shape they have been given. But doing nothing visible is not the same as doing nothing. And the something he was doing, in the non-visible register, was building. Charlotte wasn't unaware of the larger situation. Plus, she was, in my opinion, a child. But she was that specific kind of child who absorbs the emotional climate of the people around her with a precision that adults routinely underestimate. She hadn't missed the shift in her father. She hadn't missed the particular quality of attention he brought to conversations about the gathering, the way certain topics moved through the family's shared space with an altered gravity. She hadn't been told, in explicit terms, what was happening. But she had been reading rooms since before she could read words. She knew that her moment, the moment she hadn't intended anyone to see, had become something beyond itself. This was its own complicated thing for her to carry. She wasn't a child who wanted to be the center of consequences she hadn't chosen. She hadn't, been trying, in the moment she could no longer hold, to start anything. She had simply been a child who had reached her limit in a private moment that turned out not to be private. The fact that TBH, her reaching her limit had created this larger disturbance was something she was still working out. fitting it into the framework she was building at the age she was at, 4. Wanted them to be or not. Events. William wanted them to be or not. Events. William saw her working this out. He saw it the way he saw most things about his children, without making a production of seeing, without turning his observation into a conversation she wasn't ready to have. He gave her the space to process it in her own time, and he made himself available without being present in a way that demanded she give him access to her processing. This was harder than it sounds. Every parental instinct he had wanted to close the distance, to intervene, to make it smaller and safer and more manageable. But he had learned, painfully, that the most protective thing a parent can sometimes do is resist the impulse to manage their child's experience of difficulty. He protected her where he could protect her. The rest he let her hold. Camilla, during this period, made a decision that requires understanding the particular kind of courage that comes not from aggression, but from the willingness to have an uncomfortable conversation. Actually, she spoke to William, not through intermediaries, not through the careful diplomatic channels that the institution provides as an alternative to direct human exchange. Directly, I mean, in the way that two adults who have been circling a problem can sometimes, when the cost of continued circling becomes visible enough, simply stop circling. The conversation wasn't easy. Plus, easy is not a standard that applies to conversations between a stepmother and a stepson who are navigating a situation in which his daughter has been hurt by her child. It was honest in the way that conversations involving people who respect each other are honest, not because honesty is comfortable, but because it's the only foundation on which anything real can be built. What Camilla acknowledged in this conversation wasn't everything William needed, but it was more than the institution's standard protocol would have produced. She acknowledged that Tom had been careless. She, TBH, acknowledged that careless with Charlotte wasn't an acceptable operating mode. She did not construct a defense. She did not explain or contextualize or offer the mitigating factors that would have transformed Tom's behavior into something understandable and therefore forgiven. She offered the simpler, harder thing, recognition of damage and responsibility for it. William received this with the same precision with which he had been holding everything. He wasn't transformed by it. The ledger inside him did not close, simply because a conversation had taken place. But I think something shifted in the architecture of the situation. A door that had been held rigidly shut was opened, not wide, but enough to allow light into the space where the conversation would need to continue. Tom wasn't part of this conversation. He wasn't, at this point, fully aware of the scope of what had been set in motion by the moment he had been careless in a room that contained Charlotte. He understood, in the general way that adults understand when they have caused offense, that something had landed wrong. He did not understand the depth of the landing. He did not understand that the architecture of the situation had expanded to include the institution, the narrative being assembled by external observers. The complicated interior processing of a child whose feelings he had treated as casualty. He was operating, in other words, at the surface level of the event. Everyone else had moved below the surface and was working in dimensions he hadn't yet entered. This gap, between his understanding of what had happened and everyone else's understanding, was itself a problem. Because problems that aren't fully understood by all participants have a way of reasserting themselves. The moment you believe something is over, because you've moved past it in your own emotional timeline, is often precisely the moment it begins, for the people who haven't had the luxury of moving past it, to require some form of account. The account was coming. William hadn't given up on it simply because a conversation with Camilla had taken place. The conversation had been a necessary condition for what came next. But it wasn't, I think, the thing itself. Charlotte, meanwhile, had done something that nobody in this entire situation, Not William, not Camilla, not the people assembling the narrative, not Tom, had fully anticipated. She, in my opinion, had, in the quiet way of perceptive children who are also, at their core, their father's daughter, formed a position of her own. She actually wasn't broken by what had happened. She wasn't diminished, in my opinion, by it. She had absorbed it and processed it in the particular way that children who have grown up carrying the weight of double lives learn to process things by translating them into knowledge, by look, adding them to the internal map they're building of the world and the people in it, by deciding what they mean and filing them in the appropriate place. What she had filed this in wasn't the category of wound. It was something more precise. The category, basically, if she had words for it yet, and she was developing them, you could see that in her face, in the particular quality of her watchfulness, was closer to understanding. Understanding of a kind that childhood is supposed to protect you from for a few more years. She was losing that protection faster than anyone wanted her to. This wasn't new, so this had been true from the first moment she appeared in, public, held in her parents' arms, with those eyes already doing more than seeing. But the rate of acceleration was something William had been trying to slow. And what Tom had done, in his casual carelessness, was push the acceleration forward. That was the thing. Well, not just the comment, not just the tears, and the acceleration of a child toward an understanding of how people use other people, of what it means to be someone whose feelings are treated as available rather than private, of how the world inside the palace and the world outside it conspire in different ways to claim pieces of you that you'd rather keep. William was going to address this. The question of how was almost settled. The question of when was close behind it. And somewhere in the complicated geography of the family, Charlotte was waiting. Not with the helpless waiting of someone who needs to be rescued, but with the composed, watchful waiting of someone who has already decided that whatever happened next, she was going to be all right. She had her father's stubbornness in that, the good version of it, the kind that holds there's a particular kind of reckoning that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a scene. It doesn't produce the kind of confrontation that makes a satisfying story in the telling. Raised voices, slammed doors, the theatrical release of accumulated pressure. Well, it arrives instead as a change in temperature so precise and so deliberate that the person on the receiving end can feel it before they can name it, can sense the difference in how a room holds them without being able to point to the specific element that has shifted. This is the, to be fair, kind that lasts. The theatrical kind discharges and is forgotten. The quiet kind, you know, remains because it's structural. It's changed the architecture, not merely disturbed the air. Why, William was fluent in the quiet kind. He had spent his life in rooms where people communicated in the spaces between words, where the most significant things were the things that weren't said, where power expressed itself not through volume, but through the alteration of access. He had been on the receiving end of this fluency often enough to understand its mechanics completely. He, I guess, had been learning to use it himself for decades, and he had learned it the way you learn anything from being both harmed by it and surrounded by practitioners, thoroughly, and with a precision that his opponents consistently underestimated. Tom Parker Bowles began to notice it, gradually, in the way that the temperature of rooms changes when you've fallen out of the warmth of certain people's good graces. It wasn't that he was excluded from anything formally. He wasn't told, in explicit terms, that something had changed. And the family, to be fair, continued to function on its visible surface with the same carefully maintained appearance of coherent unity. The official occasions continued, which the photographs were taken. The statements were issued. Nothing in the public record suggested that anything had been disrupted. But I guess access is not the same as inclusion You can be in the room and still feel the room has been reorganized around a center that no longer includes you, and you can attend the gathering and find that the quality of engagement you once received has been replaced with something more correct, more formal, more precisely calibrated, the kind of courtesy that's so complete it can't be mistaken for warmth. Tom was charming. He had built a career and a public persona on the strength of his social intelligence. He could read a room. And what he was reading, in the rooms he occupied in the months after the gathering, it was that he had broken something, and the evidence of the breaking was in the careful way the people who mattered were handling him, like a piece of restored china that has been glued back together, usable, displayed in the cabinet, but not quite trusted with the heavy everyday use. He understood, finally, the full scope of what had happened. Not just that he had been careless, not just that Charlotte had been upset. He understood the specific weight of it, that William had known, and had processed what he knew with the full depth of a father who understood exactly what it meant for that particular child to reach her limit, and that his mother had gone to William directly and had that conversation, and that the conversation had been honest in a way that did not benefit Tom's position within it. He wasn't a man without self-awareness. He had the self-awareness that charming people develop, not as a natural quality, but as a tool to be assembled in response to the accumulated evidence that charm alone is insufficient when you've consistently been careless with the people whose opinion of you actually matters. He understood that what he had done wasn't minor. He understood that it had been received as not minor. He understood that the repair, if repair was possible, would require something from him that wasn't the deployment of charm. What it would require was the harder thing, the accounting. Plus, Charlotte, meanwhile, they had moved through the intervening months with the particular resilience that William had been watching develop in her since she was small enough to carry. She pretty much wasn't dwelling, and she wasn't presenting the experience as an ongoing wound. She had done what she did, absorbed, processed, filed, and she was living forward from the filing point with the directedness that characterized everything about her. She was, in my opinion, at an age where the world was expanding constantly, so where every week brought new information about what she was capable of, what she understood, what she cared about, what she wanted to become. The incident at the gathering wasn't absent from her internal map, but it wasn't the territory. It was a marker on the map, one data point among many, contributing to the larger picture she was building of how the world worked and who the people in it were. What it had contributed, specifically, was a piece of knowledge about boundaries. Not the abstract knowledge that children are taught, the words and the lessons and the careful parental guidance. The embodied knowledge that comes from having a boundary crossed, from feeling what that feels like in your body and your chest, and the specific place behind your eyes where tears accumulate before they fall, and then making the decision, from that place of embodied knowledge, about what you were and weren't going to accept going forward. She was building, from this and from everything else, a self that was hers, that wasn't available for the kind of casual use that Tom had applied to it, that was watchful and composed and capable of enormous feeling and equally capable of protecting the enormous feeling from people who hadn't earned access to it. William watched this honestly and felt the specific kind of emotion that fathers feel when their children demonstrate, without seeking approval for it, that they're going to be all right. Not the easy, kind of all right that comes from never having been tested. Look, the real kind, the kind that has been built from materials that include difficulty. He was proud of her in a way that he wouldn't have known how to articulate if anyone had asked. Which they didn't, because this was a private thing, belonging to the private track of their lives, and he kept the private track private, with a vigilance that hadn't diminished. The reckoning, with Tom, when it arrived in, its final form, wasn't a scene. It was a series of precisely calibrated reductions. Access to certain events, quietly managed. The "I think" quality of warmth in encounters, adjusted downward to the formal register. The sense that Tom occupied a position of genuine inclusion within the family's inner circle, rather than its functional perimeter, gently, unmistakably, permanently revised. None of this was ever stated. None of it, for what it's worth, could have been quoted. See, if you had attempted to describe it to someone outside the situation, it would have sounded like nothing, like normal family distance, like the natural fluctuation of large and complicated extended family relationships. But Tom felt it, and feeling it, he understood what it meant. It meant that William had measured the gap between who Tom said he was and what Tom had done, and had found the gap too wide to be bridged by Camilla's conversation and the passage of time alone. It meant that trust, once adjusted in William's internal ledger, did not readjust automatically. It had well to be earned back through a sustained demonstration of something different, and that demonstration hadn't yet been made. Until it was made, Tom would occupy the position he occupied, acknowledged, included in the formal sense, but held at the precise distance that protection of Charlotte required. This wasn't vindictiveness. William wasn't a vindictive man, which he was a precise one. The distance wasn't punishment. It was calibration. It was the adjustment of proximity to match demonstrated trustworthiness, and it would remain until the demonstrated trustworthiness changed. Camilla understood this. Plus, she did not attempt to negotiate against it. She was a woman who had, over the course of a life that had included more than its share of being held at managed distances by people who had measured her and found her wanting, while developed a full understanding of the difference between distances that were temporary and distances that were structural. This one, she understood, was somewhere between the two. It could move, but it would only move in one direction, and only in response to specific evidence. She communicated this to Tom in the way mothers communicate things to adult children when the things are difficult and the relationship is strong enough to carry difficulty without collapsing under it. Thomwood would have given him a version of the assessment to spare him discomfort, because softening it would have been a disservice. It would have given him a version of the situation that was more comfortable but less accurate, and inaccurate maps are how people walk into places they can't get out of. I think Tom sat with this. He sat with it in the way that people sit with things that require them to revise their understanding of themselves, not quickly, not easily, with the particular resistance that comes from having spent a long time being charming enough that revision was rarely necessary. But he sat with it. The thing about the royal family, the thing that makes it different from civilian families in ways that haven't got to do with palaces and ceremonies and the weight of centuries, is that it can't afford the luxury of unresolved things. Like, unresolved things accumulate. They create structural weakness, which they become, over time, the fault lines that break open under pressure and produce the catastrophic events that fill the history books and the front pages and the documentaries that arrive decades later to explain, with the benefit of hindsight, what everyone should have seen coming. The people who ran the institution knew this. William knew this. It was part of why he hadn't simply let his protective fury run its full course, because full courses in this context produce exactly the kind of rupture that damages not just the individuals involved, but the larger structure that those individuals are embedded in. His job, as he understood it, wasn't to protect only Charlotte's feelings. It was to manage the situation in a way that addressed the damage without creating more damage in the process. This required holding two things simultaneously: the genuine protective anger of a father and the strategic patience of a man who understood institutional mathematics. The balance between them wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary, and he maintained it with the consistency that his years inside this life had built into him, the consistency that looked from the outside like composure, and was, from the inside, the sustained effort of a man who was always doing more than he appeared to be doing. There was a moment, not a scene, but a moment, that served as the quiet pivot point around which the situation turned. It was small. It would have been invisible to anyone not watching for it. Charlotte and Tom were in the same space at a subsequent gathering, a later occasion in the calendar, one of the many points at which the extended family assembled itself and performed its unity. Charlotte noticed him the way she always noticed things, completely, without appearing to notice at all. She had her grandfather's gift for this, the capacity to be fully present without being visibly focused, to take in a room while appearing to be somewhere else. Tom was aware of her in the specific way of a person who knows they have caused harm to someone standing nearby and is navigating the discomfort of that awareness without a script for how to navigate it. What happened wasn't a conversation, and it was the space before a conversation. The moment when two people who have unfinished business between them and no established language for addressing it occupy the same room and feel the unfinished business as a weight in the air between them. Charlotte held her composure with the ease of someone for whom composure had become, through practice and through the particular demands of her life, a genuine resource rather than a performance. Tom held his with more effort. The effort was visible if you knew what to look for. William was in the room. He wasn't watching, which he was, as he always was, doing exactly what was required of him in the visible register, while the rest of his attention was elsewhere, specifically and continuously elsewhere, in the invisible register, where fathers keep track of the things that matter most. He noted the moment. He noted Charlotte's composure and what it meant, not the absence of feeling, but the presence of self-possession. He noted Tom's effort and what it meant, the beginning, possibly, of the sustained demonstration that would be required before proximity could be restored to something warmer. It wasn't resolution. Resolution, in the royal family, is a concept that applies to diplomatic agreements and formal statements. It doesn't apply to the complicated, ongoing, lived experience of people who are bound together by history and institution and the particular accident of having been born into, or married into, or stepped into a family that's also a nation's story. What it was, instead, was continuation, the ongoing management of something that couldn't be resolved because it wasn't a problem with a solution, but a condition with a history that had been added to by what Tom had done, and that Charlotte was now carrying with the rest of her history, and that William was factoring into the adjustments he made continuously to the architecture of protection he maintained around his children. Charlotte had been left in tears. That was true. That actually had happened, and its happening had set in motion everything. That followed. The reckoning, the conversation, the calibrated distance, the quiet pivot point in the subsequent gathering. But the tears hadn't defined her. They kind of were a moment in a life, a single data point on a map that was growing larger and more detailed with every week she lived. She was still adding to the map. She was still watching, still filing, still building the self that was hers and not available for casual use by people who hadn't earned access to it. She was, in the particular way that her watchfulness had always suggested she would be, becoming. William was watching her become, and he had been watching since the beginning, since the Lindo Wing steps, since the first public appearance, since the first time he noticed that the watchfulness in her eyes wasn't a child's anxiety, but something closer to a child's deep and serious engagement with the world. He had watched her through everything the life had required of her, and through this too. He did not know what she would become. No parent does. But he knew the quality of what was being built. He knew it the way you know things that you've been paying attention to without interruption. That you've actually learned not through study, but through the sustained practice of presence. She was going to be all right. More than all right. She was going to be something that the people who had been careless with her would eventually understand they had underestimated. Not because they would be made to understand it, not through drama, not through confrontation, not through the theatrical kind of reckoning that makes good stories. They would understand it because she would become fully visible in the way that people who have been doing the work of becoming are eventually visible, and they would see in that visibility the cost of having been casual with something that deserved careful handling. Tom Parker Bowles would understand it. Not all at once, in increments, over time. With the growing clarity that comes from watching someone demonstrate, through the sustained evidence of who they're, that what you did to them mattered less to their trajectory than to yours. That was the particular mathematics of this situation, not the mathematics of damage, how much was done, to whom, at what cost. The look, mathematics of character, and of what gets built in people who have been tested by things they did not choose, and who build from those materials not complaint, but capability. Charlotte was doing the building, which the palace moved around her, as it always had, with its corridors and its kitchens and its invisible agreements. In my opinion, institution continued its management of public perception. The narrative outside continued its assembly of a version of events that served purposes other than truth. The family continued its performance of coherent unity on the occasions that required it. And underneath all of that, in the private track that William protected with everything he had, a girl was growing up, getting sharper. To be honest, getting clearer, adding to the map, learning from the, to be honest, most specific kind of experience, the kind that comes from the inside, from having been the person in the room when something happened, what the world was made of, and what she was made of in response to it. The tears had been real. What came basically after them was more real still. And what would come after that, the full shape of who Charlotte was becoming, was something none of them could see yet from where they stood. But it was coming. You could feel it if you were paying the right kind of attention, in the quality of her stillness, in the precision of her watchfulness, plus in the way she moved through rooms that were too complicated for children, with the composure of someone who had already begun, quietly and without announcement, to prepare. The secret William was never supposed to know had reached him. He had received it, and acted on it, and protected his daughter with it, to the extent that it was his to use. The rest belonged to Charlotte. The rest always had. Plus, she actually was the one who had been in the room. She was the one who had held it, and she would be the one, when the time was right and the map was complete enough, who decided what it meant.